London, 1967. Late October. The kind of night where the air inside a club smells like cigarette smoke and old wood and something electric that nobody can quite name. The Marquee Club on Wardour Street had a backstage that wasn't really a backstage. It was a corridor, a few wooden chairs, a cracked mirror nailed to the wall, two bulbs hanging from the ceiling without shades. Someone had taped a set list to the door. Half of it had peeled off and curled at the corner. The floor was sticky near the door and dry everywhere else. A guitar case sat open against the wall with nothing inside it. There was a smell, sweat and rosin, and something sweet and burnt underneath everything. That particular smell that old venues accumulate over years of the same thing happening inside them, night after night, until the walls start to hold it. Jimi Hendrix was sitting in one of those chairs with his jacket still on, talking to someone. He wasn't performing that night. He was there to watch, to be around the music, to exist in that particular atmosphere that only certain venues in London seemed to produce in those years. Jeff Beck was on the other side of the room. He was tuning his guitar, slowly, not looking at anyone. His fingers worked the tuning pegs the way hands work when the mind is somewhere else. Automatic, practiced, almost absent-minded. Like the guitar was just a thing his hands knew how to do without him needing to be involved. Jimmy watched him for a moment. Then he leaned toward the person sitting next to him and said quietly, barely above the noise of the room, "He's good, technically, but he plays it safe, never really goes anywhere he hasn't already been." The person nodded, maybe agreed, maybe just nodded. Jeff Beck didn't look up from his guitar. Nobody was certain whether he heard it. That was always the thing about Jeff Beck. You could never be sure what registered and what didn't. He had this quality, a stillness that most people misread. Some called it arrogance. Some called it distance. Some just said he was hard to read. The truth was probably simpler than any of those explanations, but simpler wasn't the word people reached for when they talked about him. He set the guitar down for a second, picked up a glass, set it back without drinking from it. Then he picked the guitar up again. The room held maybe 12 people that evening. A few musicians, a roadie, a man who worked for a record label and had been standing in the same corner so long that nobody could remember who had invited him. The conversations moved the way backstage conversations always did. Fragmented, overlapping, half-finished. Someone was talking about a session that had gone wrong. Someone else was talking about a studio in Abbey Road. The noise was comfortable and familiar. Jimmy had turned back to his own conversation. He wasn't paying attention to Beck anymore. Jeff Beck stood up and walked toward the small amplifier in the corner. Nobody asked him what he was doing. Nobody said a word. He plugged in his guitar, adjusted the volume once with two fingers, checked the tone knob without looking down at it. His hands already knew where everything was. They always did. He pulled the stool closer and sat down. For a moment, nothing happened. He just sat there, guitar across his lap, eyes somewhere on the floor in front of him, not nervous, not performing, not building towards something, just sitting with the instrument the way you sit with something you've known for a long time, waiting for whatever comes next to arrive on its own terms. Then he started playing. He didn't announce anything. There was no setup, no small talk, no adjustment period. Just the first note, and something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. It wasn't a gasp or a sudden hush. It was more like the temperature dropped half a degree, or the air pressure changed the way it does in the minutes before a storm arrives and before you can see any clouds. One of the roadies stopped coiling a cable. He didn't put it down. His hands just froze mid-motion, cable half-looped, and he stood there with his eyes on Beck, the way people look at something they didn't expect to understand, and suddenly find their understanding. Jeff Beck played slowly at first. Each note landed with intention. Each silence between the notes was just as deliberate as the notes themselves. There was no hurry in it. He wasn't trying to demonstrate anything. He wasn't building toward a moment where people would react. He was following something, some internal thread that only he could hear. And the rest of the room was simply allowed to follow if they chose. They chose. One by one, the conversation stopped. Not because anyone called for quiet, not because someone held up a hand or cleared their throat. The music just made conversation feel wrong, the way laughing feels wrong in the wrong room. It wasn't grief, it was just, this isn't the right thing to be doing right now. Jimmy had stopped talking mid-sentence. He didn't realize it immediately. At some point, he just became aware that he hadn't said anything in a while, and that his friend hadn't said anything either, and that the room had gone the particular kind of quiet that rooms almost never go. What Beck was doing was difficult to locate. That was the strange part. It wasn't technically overwhelming. He wasn't playing fast. There were no moments that made you think, how did he do that? No passages where the hands seemed to defy what hands can do. It was something else entirely. Every note found somewhere specific to land. Not in the air, not in the room, but somewhere interior, behind the sternum, in the place where things that actually matter seem to go when they arrive. He bent a string, held it there, let it come back. The note didn't disappear when it ended. It seemed to stay, suspended, the way a sentence stays after someone says something true and both people in the room know it. Jimmy's hands were resting on his knees. He noticed them there. 2 hands, completely still. He couldn't remember the last time his own hands had been this still. He was a person who was always doing something with his hands, adjusting, gesturing, reaching for something. But right now they were just there, resting, like they had nowhere to be. He was thinking something, not fully aware that he was thinking it. Something like, "This is the thing I said he couldn't do." He didn't say it out loud. The playing lasted maybe 4 minutes, maybe 5. Beck didn't build to a climax. He didn't resolve it the way you'd expect a resolution to sound. He just stopped, the way a thought stops when it's finished itself. The music had gotten to wherever it needed to go, and there was nothing left to add to it, and so he didn't add anything. He sat back slightly on the stool. He looked at his hands for a brief moment. Then he set the guitar gently against the amplifier and let it rest there. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the full kind of silence, the kind that comes after something real has happened and the room hasn't caught up to it yet. Nobody wanted to be the one to break it, because breaking it would mean acknowledging that it was over. Somebody eventually said something. What it was, nobody present could agree on later. Just a small sound, a word, something to reopen the air. The roadie finished coiling his cable. The record label man looked down at his notebook and found he'd written something without meaning to. The conversations came back slowly, quietly, like people returning to a room after a fire alarm turns out to be nothing. Grateful, a little unsettled, not quite the same as before. Someone turned to Jimmy. "What do you think?" Jimmy didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the space where Beck had been sitting, the stool, the guitar leaning against the amp. He was looking at the place where it had happened, as though the place still held something. "I don't know," he said. "I genuinely don't know what that was." He left early that night. He didn't make an event of it. Just said he was tired, said goodnight to a couple of people, and walked out into the cold on Warder Street. He stood on the pavement for a moment before he started walking. No particular direction at first, just moving. He kept returning to what he had said. He plays it safe. He had meant it when he said it, or he had believed he meant it. Looking at Beck from the outside, the composure, the control, the absolute absence of showmanship, it had read as caution, as the behavior of a man who knew exactly how far to go and had decided not to go any further. But that wasn't what he had heard tonight. What he heard was someone who had gone so far inward that there was no need for the outward anymore. No need to signal, no need to display, no need to show anything at all. The thing was simply there, inside the music, and you either heard it or you didn't. Jimmy had heard it. He walked. The city moved around him. Taxis, voices, lights in windows, the sound of another venue somewhere up the block. He barely registered any of it. He was replaying the room. Not the music itself, because the music wasn't the kind of thing you could replay. It had happened in real time, and it existed in real time, and now it was over. What he kept replaying was the room around the music, the roadie with the frozen hands, the silence that built without anyone choosing to build it. His own hands on his knees, still for the first time in as long as he could remember. He got home late and picked up his own guitar, not to work on anything, not to practice a particular passage or solve a technical problem he'd been thinking about. Just to sit with it, to see what happened when you stop trying to arrive somewhere and let the music find its own address. He wasn't sure it worked. He stayed at it until close to 4 in the morning. He didn't tell anyone why. 3 years later, in the summer of 1970, a journalist sat across from Jimi and asked him about the guitarists he admired. He mentioned several names. Near the end of the conversation, almost as an afterthought, he said Beck's name. "He does something I've spent a long time trying to understand," Jimi said. "He doesn't perform the music. He just is the music. While it's happening, there's no distance between him and it." The journalist asked whether Jimi thought he could do the same thing. Jimi was quiet for a moment. He looked at a point somewhere past the journalist's shoulder. The way people look when they are not seeing what's in front of them. When they're seeing something else, something interior, something that's been sitting in there a while and hasn't fully resolved. He wasn't performing the pause. He was actually thinking about it. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm still learning." He said it without irony, without the kind of careful, calibrated humility that people perform in interviews. He said it the way someone says something they've been sitting with for a long time and still haven't resolved. Beck heard that interview eventually. Someone played it for him years later, after Jimi was gone. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When it finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He heard it. Most people don't." That was all he said. He picked up his guitar and started playing something quiet. Nobody in the room said anything. They had learned by then when not to.